I've been getting into hyperlapses quite a bit. I've tried a couple of different techniques, so I thought it might be handy to go through 6 different techniques to achieve a hyperlapse effect and their pros and cons. First of all, the traditional sort of style, where you will take a photo and walk a step, and then take a photo and walk a step. For this you will need a tripod or a monopod, and preferably some sort of guidelines on your screen so that you can frame your subject in the right spot every single time. That way, when you put it all together, your subject doesn't go all over the place. The cons of this method are that it is very, very, very time consuming and very easy to screw up. If you shift your subject every so often and make it drift, or if you miss it once or twice, you will get jolts in your hyperlapse, and it's a lot of time to commit for something that can go wrong. So even though it is the most risky and the most time consuming, the reason that people do it that way is because the results are pretty much the best, because you are in control of your shutter speed to create motion blur. The resolution of your RAW files will be much bigger than 4K, so you have loads of scope to sort of edit it in post and reframe it. And you can also edit your RAW files much more than you could pull and push and pull a video file. My choice at the moment, using devices like my GH5 on a gimbal, is just to film in 4K 24p and walk slowly and carefully and then smush the footage in post-production. You want to get between 3 to 5 minutes to get a decent sized hyperlapse. Now, with the gimbals, I personally use the Zhiyun Weebill Lab for this, because if you have a lower framed shot, you can stick it in sling mode, which is just much more comfortable. And in the standard mode, it's a very light gimbal, so it doesn't hurt your back as much. And because the axis at the back is lower, you can see the screen very, very clearly without having to flip it out. Now, with the Zhiyun gimbals, you have the options of, if your subject is dead ahead, you can stick it in full lock mode, so no matter where you move, the camera will stay center. This is the best way so your time lapses don't do this. But if you set off and you're even slightly off course, things can drift. Another way to work with the Zhiyun products for hyperlapse is to actually connect the phone app and stick it on top of your phone using a hot shoe mount. And then you can use active tracking on the phone, which will in turn move the gimbal. Mind blown. The next one physically is a very similar setup to the previous one. So you'll have your camera on a gimbal, and it's quite niche. It depends if your camera has this function or not, and that is your variable frame rate. Traditionally, your variable frame rate is used in the opposite direction to get like super slow motion, and you can see in camera in real time how the slow motion has turned out. Now, if you take that shutter speed and go in the opposite direction and speed it up, you can have a nice slow shutter speed in camera. And the best thing about it, Emily's getting giddy, is once you've finished your hyperlapse using variable frame rate, you will see it in real time sped up. You'll be able to see straight away without any editing whatsoever if it's worked or not. I think that alone is worth its weight in gold, because not only could you then sort of upload it straight away and share it without any editing, but if you've buggered it up, and it's quite easy to do with hyperlapses. Like this time when I was doing one at the Live building, and at the very end I tripped over my own feet. Livid. So you can see straight away in camera whether it's worked or not. And if it hasn't worked, you can do it again. If it has worked, no more editing required. Number 3 is very similar to variable frame rate, except you can use this if your camera doesn't have the variable frame rate option. And that's simulating the same effect using a time lapse. So you can put your camera on a gimbal and set your time lapse up to maybe have like ½ second shutter speed, and then maybe 2 seconds before the next shot comes, etc. If you have a camera like the Lumix cameras, again, you'll be able to see in real time whether it's worked or not, because you can make a time lapse in camera and you can see straight away what it looks like. It will give you all of the motion blur Sometimes if you shoot in video, the motion blur, the lack of motion blur, can make it look a little bit staccato and fake. But if you do it with a longer shutter speed in a time-lapse mode, you will get the motion blur and you will be able to see it in camera straight away. And because you've got the raw files, just like option A with the tripod that takes like an hour, you can then edit the raw files to your heart's content, and you've got loads and loads of resolution to work with. But you don't have to spend an hour taking a photo, stopping, taking a photo, stopping. You can just do it on a gimbal and it works perfectly fine. My weapon of choice for these sorts of things has to be the Weebill Lab. I have done this with larger, heavier gimbals, and the thing is, once you start moving, you can't blooming move. So if you don't get your posture right straight away, at the end of those 5 minutes, it can feel like a lifetime. So having a lighter, smaller gimbal to do all this with, blooming brilliant. Same sort of technique, but instead of having a gimbal and a large setup, you would be using a device that has built-in stabilization. So we would be looking at the DJI Osmo Pocket, we would be looking at the Mavic Pro if you wanted to do an aerial hyperlapse, we would be looking at the GoPro Hero 7, which the stabilization in that is ridiculous. Again, this will be a very similar technique. You frame up your subject and off you go. With the Osmo Pocket, you can use active track and sort of very easily maneuver around the subject without adding any effort on your part, which I personally love. And finally, for the truly mobile experience, you can use apps to do this on your phone and cut out your cameras entirely. I would use the Zhiyun Smooth 4 for this, though I suppose most gimbals would work. But why I would choose the Smooth 4 is, as with the other styles of hyperlapses, if you're going straight ahead, you want your gimbal to be in full lock mode. And with the Smooth 4, you have that on a button. So you can just make sure you're in lock mode and then off you go. So the main thing to take away from your hyperlapses is, unless you want to do it the very elongated way with your tripod and your monopod, you will need some kind of stabilization in order to pull this effect off. There are many, many different things available to stabilize your footage, from like a one wheel to a gimbal to inbuilt stabilization. And then the second thing you need to bear in mind is the subject of your hyperlapse needs to stay vaguely in the same space throughout. And then finally, the thing to bear in mind with hyperlapses is, generally speaking, they do work better with a bit of motion blur. Whether that is achieved in camera with a longer shutter speed or added in post-production, you do sell the effect a lot better with longer shutter speeds. So stable, have an interesting subject, and have some motion blur, and off you go. Get inventive. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Thank you very much.